Good afternoon. My name is Richard Pither, and I'm here to talk about reducing diagnostic uncertainty in early Alzheimer's disease through the development of a novel blood-based biomarker test. Okay, that's what Cytox is doing, and we've got some very important research studies ongoing right now that will report out later this year that will validate that proposition. So here is the issue that we're tackling today in terms of diagnostic uncertainty. An individual with a subjective memory complaint will report to a general physician, a general practitioner, and then he or she will be referred to various cognitive testing. Okay? And if those tests are still of concern, the individual will be then referred to an imaging examination, usually an MRI, perhaps in the UK a CT exam, and that exam is to rule out a potential cause such as a brain tumor or a stroke that could explain the early memory symptoms associated with that individual. And if that test is still clear, then the next step is a kind of watchful waiting for 3 or 4 or 5 years to see whether the individual progresses or not. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty for the clinician, for the individual at that stage. And that's what we're trying to address with our test. And here's the reason for the uncertainty. Alzheimer's disease and dementia is not the same as normal aging. But the very early stages are very difficult to distinguish. In other words, those very early memory deficits are very non-specific in nature. So what you don't know as an individual or as a physician is whether the individual is on a normal, healthy aging curve or whether they're at the start of a much more rapid decline towards full-blown dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And that's where novel testing is actually required. The fact that these tests today that are available are failing is evident in the track record of failure of large pharmaceutical companies to develop novel therapies for treating this disease. So there have been no new drugs approved for Alzheimer's disease treatment in the last 10 years. And there have been a huge number of failures, most notably in one particular therapeutic class known as the anti-amyloid drugs. And the big question that the industry is facing now is whether amyloid is actually an appropriate target for therapeutic intervention, or whether it's simply that the individuals recruited into those trials are at such a late stage in their disease progression that the drugs are having no chance to actually demonstrate efficacy. So there are a number of tests that pharma companies and physicians might use at this stage to try and answer this question about whether these are symptoms due to early Alzheimer's disease or not. But these tests all have significant drawbacks. So the problem with the disease fundamentally is that the diagnosis can only be made definitively post-mortem because you're looking for cognitive and clinical symptoms in conjunction with post-mortem histopathology, for which you have to take out a piece of brain tissue, stain it, and look for the hallmark amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tangle. That's obviously not a useful diagnostic procedure. We can look inside the brain using high-end imaging technology. We can look for, in the cerebral spinal fluid via lumbar puncture, we can take out some of the fluid that bathes the brain and ask whether or not we can see changes there. And we can look at various genetic risk factors. None of these tests have proved successful clinically and or for pharma companies in finding the right subjects for early recruitment. There's huge problems associated with that. That's the problem we're trying to address with our technology. So, to go back to the original paradigm, at the point of diagnostic uncertainty, we're developing a blood test, first of all, to look for biological risk. Okay, and we call this test phenotor, which is looking at the phenotype, the behavior of lymphocytes, which are a population of cells in a blood sample. Okay, so we do that in our own laboratories in Manchester, and that's what's under development at the moment. We also have some very intriguing data that suggests that that phenotype will be underpinned by specific genetic changes in members of the so-called mTOR signaling pathway, hugely complex biological signaling pathway, for which we believe combinations of changes will ultimately allow us to define different subpopulations of Alzheimer's disease. And the significance of that, of course, is that one Alzheimer's sufferer will respond to a drug quite differently to another. And the ability to effectively practice personalized medicine and develop drugs for specific subgroups, I think is what will drive this forward in the future, and that's what we're looking to unlock at the moment. So the figures around Alzheimer's disease and dementia are truly staggering. 44 million cases globally today, expected to treble, and you can see estimates varying from 115 to 135 million by 2050. And the annual cost associated with managing those patients is around $600 billion. So a huge economic problem pending in developed world. And the UK perspective on that is 800,000 cases diagnosed today, expected to rise to 1 million in the next few years, but a huge underdiagnosis as well. So 44% is the estimate, and as you may know, the government have set new targets to try and get that up to 65%, but a huge underdiagnosis, which is creating all sorts of problems for the healthcare system. So what we're doing about that is we have a really strong research data set from our academic founder, data that was derived originally from Oxford University and has been developed since at University of Birmingham. What we're doing in Cytox is extending that research data in 2 pivotal research studies that are ongoing now. So these are actively recruiting subjects from the US, from Europe, from the UK. There are 2 studies, one in a mixed dementia population, to ask the question as to whether this risk biomarker is specific to Alzheimer's type dementia, or whether it plays a role in other dementia types or not. And the other test is looking, or the other study is looking for the ability in our test to differentiate high risk of progression in the mild cognitive impairment, the very early stages of Alzheimer's disease, from low risk. Again, hugely important clinically, but hugely important too for pharmaceutical companies looking to recruit those very early patients into their therapeutic trials, because those are the ones where you have the best chance of demonstrating efficacy of new therapies. And so we will be reporting out the data from both those studies later this year. There's a big international conference in November in Philadelphia where we expect to be reporting data from these studies, and that will drive our ability to both partner with pharma companies developing therapeutics, but also to then start the formal clinical development of this as a clinical diagnostic test that will ultimately be available via healthcare systems in the UK, Europe, and the US. Okay, that's a longitudinal 3-year study that will start at the end of this year. So in terms of the market potential for this test, we estimate that the market for providing services through a combination of license fee and service income to pharmaceutical companies wanting to use this type of test to triage and stratify subjects into their therapeutic trials is around about $500 million a year. But that the clinical diagnostic and prognostic potential for this test, once it's approved by healthcare authorities in Europe, UK, US, is in excess of $2 billion a year. And you can see that the growth, the aging demographic of the world population is driving the growth in the numbers, and the clinical need is self-evident from that. So in summary, we have a test here that is well aligned to a major unmet need, both at the level of pharma companies, clinicians, and of course the individual patients themselves. We have very strong key opinion leader backing. We are working with a network of dementia experts around the world who are very keen to contribute to the development of this technology. We have huge market potential and very strong growth dynamics within that market. And we have a very experienced leadership team. Many of you who follow diagnostic companies in the UK and Europe will know of David Evans, our chairman. Very strong track record of creating high return for investors. Myself, I have 20 years developing diagnostic and therapeutic pharmaceuticals in large and small UK and international companies, most recently GE Healthcare, where we successfully launched a diagnostic imaging agent for amyloid detection in Alzheimer's patients. And we have a very strong investor base, led by Spark Impact, who are a Liverpool-based VC company, but also strongly backed by Jim Mellon himself and a number of other investment organizations. We're not currently looking for new funding, but if our data pans out in a positive way that we expect it to by the end of the year, then we will be looking to raise additional funds, potentially through private and/or public markets at that stage. Thank you for your attention.